Hello. So this particular lecture is focused on taking some of the considerations we've already looked at with the decision making, both around theory and around some of the errors we might experience in decision making, and consider how that plays out in the real world. So the focus of this is thinking about decision-making in naturalistic context. So recognizing that when we make decisions, we're very rarely in a neat and tidy single task situation. We're almost always dealing with multiple people, multiple technologies, multiple things, and we're dealing with sort of complex work or living types of settings. So what do we mean by naturalistic decision making? Well, it's a term that's been around for a number of years, and you might be interested in one of the books that I'll refer to in the next theme, actually, called Cognition in the Wild as well. That was a really great book by Ed Hutchins that looked at sort of naturalistic workplace type settings. But in 1997, Zambok talked about naturalistic decision making as being associated with the way people use their past experience, their knowledge-based behaviour, to make decisions in field settings. And they noticed that there were a number of key characteristics that were associated with naturalistic decision making. So the first is that there were these ill-structured problems. As I say, it wasn't all neat and tidy. There were uncertain, dynamic environments. Remember that decision-making takes place over that longer time frame. So we've got this temporal pattern, and we've got this level of uncertainty and dynamic environment that comes through. And they're information-rich environments. So this is really important from a cognitive ergonomics point of view. We've got multiple sources of information. We have to think about how to design that information from an attention, memory, and workload perspective. And those situation cues might change quite rapidly. So it's not only presenting this static information, but how we present this dynamic information. We've seen this in contexts like air traffic control, like the aviation example that you saw, or some of the situations I've talked about in healthcare. So that cognitive processing proceeds in an iterative action feedback loop. This is a little bit like the recognition primed decision model I talked about in one of the earlier sets of slides, where you've got that feedback loop showing that actions influence the state of the world, and that updated state of the world is what we then use to continue influencing our decision making. And then, remember the bottom bit of the onion model, those multiple shifting and or competing individual and organisational goals. So remember the goals in the middle of the onion model, and then at the bottom of the onion model, the organisational factors that feed in. And that could be everything from financial priorities to health and safety priorities to technical capabilities to work and organisational goals and strategic priorities. That these things take place under time constraints or time stress. They're often high risk, so the consequences of those decision makings, the decision making in a naturalistic setting can be quite significant, and that multiple people are somehow involved in the decision. And we sometimes see this go wrong. So one particular characteristic of naturalistic decision making is group decision making. Example situations you might have might be an engineering planning situation. It might be a medical decision-making situation, such as the Elaine Bromley case that I referred to. And we can see different things that influence the factors, such as, for example, the notion of groupthink. Now, groupthink is something I personally observed, actually, when you're in a group of people who often quite like each other, have built quite a lot of mutual respect as a decision-making team, and have almost become used to all thinking in the same way. One of the things that, of course, my university role is about really communicating the value of diversity, not just because it's the right moral and ethical thing to do, but because diverse teams lead to better decisions being made. And one of the reasons that diverse teams lead to better decisions being made is that we bring different perspectives in very early in a decision-making phase. And that early perspective from diverse voices can often mean that issues or challenges associated with a decision can be identified early before they cost too much money or take too much time to rectify. So we potentially avoid sunk cost bias as a result as well. Now, and this is something that's very interesting to me as I've sort of moved in different roles in my university career. Time, peer and leader pressure. Time pressure is probably one of the biggest challenges that we experience when we think about group decision making. I've been in many settings where we'd have loved to have spent more time on a decision, but external pressures, whether it's external people asking for us to make a decision quickly, it could be students asking us to make a decision quickly, or it could be an external regulatory body, can sometimes lead to us having to make a decision in a quick manner. Peer pressure is interesting, so maybe not wanting to speak out against others. If you think about yourselves, you may have been in student learning community forums, and there may be 5 other students around the table who go, yeah, this module's good, this module's good, this module's good, and you might be sitting there thinking, well, actually I think Sarah's module's pretty rubbish, but I feel really embarrassed saying that because these 5 other students have said that they think it's really good, and maybe it's me, maybe I just don't understand it, or something like that. So you can very quickly find yourself in a situation of peer pressure where you feel uncomfortable about speaking out or speaking differently to others. And then, of course, there's leader pressure, and this is really interesting because when I started as an academic, I was 25, 26. I was always the youngest in the room. I was always the most junior in the room. And so I'd sit there and think, oh, golly, that terribly important looking person over there must know more than me. And I better not sort of say anything because they might shout me down. And frankly, sometimes they did shout me down. Now I'm often the most senior person in the room. I'm not always the oldest person in the room yet. And actually, in that particular situation, it's very interesting because I try my very best not to influence decision making as a leader, but of course I end up doing so with the best intentions because I'm given the role of chair, I'm given the strategic responsibility for something, and so trying to use techniques such as going around the room and making sure everyone else has the opportunity to speak, speaking to the more junior people in the room really specifically and asking them to share their views, is something that can work very well to overcome that leader pressure. But I know that people are still looking for the reaction on my face when they say something or there's a decision that's made. The opposite could be isolated decision making. So making a decision in a group, but not necessarily thinking about the wider context of that decision. So not necessarily thinking about how your decision affects the overall working of the system. Inappropriate risk perception. Again, we're seeing this so much at the moment in terms of COVID because first of all, the genuinely rapidly changing nature of science, and then also our own personal biases and perceptions that we're bringing to the situation. One of the things might be that we judge people and we may be completely inappropriate in that. So we might judge people if someone comes in and, I don't know, we do an icebreaker exercise and we ask what people's favourite music is. And I might stereotype someone if they say they like rap music versus classical music. I might make a judgment on the basis of what people are wearing. Actually, one of the brilliant things about us working in an online environment is it feels to me like some of these biases are being removed. So no longer are we all sitting there in our smart, I never managed to look smart, but our smart business dress. I love the fact that I can have a meeting from home and still wear my slippers. And so I think there's a really interesting sort of challenge that we're seeing to some of these stereotypes through the enforced remote working that we're doing as a result of COVID. And then the role of expertise. Again, we're seeing this play out in COVID tremendously, but first of all, a lack sometimes of acknowledgement of expertise within the room, especially if that specialist expertise is held by someone who is not necessarily the most senior person in the room. And then we also see the opposite, where there is a lack of deference to expertise in a situation where someone believes that they hold the highest level of expertise, and so they don't defer or listen to someone who might be less qualified than them, might have less specific scientific experience than them, that maybe has more life experience, or maybe just has looked at the problem in a slightly different way and allowed the problem to be solved in a different way. Do have a look at some of the materials around the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. This was a very, very sad incident that happened many years ago now. But one of the things that was found was there was an engineering failure. There was a failure of something called an O-ring, which was a very, very important seal that unfortunately resulted in the escape of some fuel that ignited several seconds after takeoff. And all of the astronauts were killed. And one of the saddest things is that it became clear that an engineer had highlighted that there was a potential challenge, particularly with the performance of this O-ring seal in particular environmental conditions. But this was a very high-profile space shuttle launch, and the temperature was unusually low. But the TV networks were particularly keen to show it was a very high-profile launch for various reasons. TV networks were keen to show it. They'd already missed a launch window once, so there was a lot of sort of external pressure to go ahead with the launch, as well as the financial cost of postponing a launch. And so the information about the performance of the O-ring somehow didn't feed into the decision making about whether to proceed with the launch or not. And it's felt that this is something around group decision making that this particular incident highlights. So I just want to talk a little bit about a particular method called critical decision method. It's a method that my students have used quite a lot actually. And it's a really helpful method to try to get to the nub of the factors that have influenced decision making in practice. So what you do when you apply critical decision method is you ask an individual to run through a candidate incident. I've got a student using this at the moment, looking at cybersecurity incidents and situations when you've unwittingly fallen victim to some sort of cybersecurity fraud or spam email or something like this. And what happens is you run through the candidate incident, but you use particular probes around the cues that we used, the knowledge that people brought to the incident, the goals that people had, other sort of analogous type of incidents that might be potentially appropriate, the time pressure and the situation assessment that they made at the time. And then those outputs are analysed in terms of the recognition primed decision model. And I thought it was just useful just to show you some of the example critical decision method probes that are used. They focus around goal specification, cue identification, expectancy, and the conceptual model. I won't read them all out, but you've got them all written here in front of you. Influence of uncertainty, information integration, situation awareness and situation assessment. And then options, decision blocking, so factors that might have influenced the decision such as stress, the basis of a choice that's made, and then other types of analogies or generalizations that could be drawn from the particular situation. So I'll just conclude with thinking about what we do about all of these factors that we've identified. So we've talked about the different theories around decision making. We've talked about the biases, the different types of decision making we might want to encourage in different times. Remember, sometimes we want to encourage type 2 thinking rather than type 1 thinking, for example. So what can we do in order to encourage and minimise the impact of decision making and decision making bias? There are just some examples here, but I'd really love to talk through with you in the lecture consolidation session what you think might be really good examples of ways to minimise decision-making bias in a real-world setting. So first of all, having planned time to review and reflect on decisions. I've done this with interview panels actually, where if we've been particularly tired at the end of the day or we've got a particularly uncertain decision, several times we've actually agreed to stop and go away, particularly if maybe we're aware that one person might feel uncomfortable with the decision or something like that, and ask them to go away and think about it and reflect and come back. And that can be a really, really helpful way of just managing that bias in decision making. setting objective criteria and being really clear and working through criteria that we're using for decision making, whether this is, for example, a procurement process or choosing where to go on your holiday or deciding who to appoint on an interview. It probably won't surprise you to know that I have insisted over the years, me and my family go on a very big holiday, hopefully every 2 years. We're due next year. And it's me, my dad and his wife, my husband and my kids, my sister and her kids, my brother, his wife and her kids. There's about 15 of us in general. There's occasionally people come and go. It's a nightmare working out where to go. We just book a big holiday cottage somewhere in the UK. Obviously, the kids have got bigger over the years. Mine are the eldest. And a few years ago, I got so frustrated with us all nearly falling out over where to go on holiday that I set up a spreadsheet and I came up with our objective criteria. And they were things like, how many bathrooms do we want? Do we want to be near the sea? Do we want a games room? Do we want facilities nearby that we can go to? How far is it from each of our houses? We all live in different parts of the country. And then we went through and we ticked various boxes and then we made our decision on the basis of objective decision-making criteria and also preserved family harmony in the process. Taking time to make decisions can be really important. Actually, this year, the family booking holiday process was quite stressful because of the pandemic. Lots of things were booked out for next year. And I had to intervene and request that we took some extra time over our decision making, because decision making in hurried situations doesn't necessarily lead to the best decisions. And fortunately, my family took it in the humour it was intended. Present knowledge in the world in a structured format to influence primacy and salience. Remember that susceptibility to bias that we have, either through our own individual preferences or through dominance of information. So if we actually have in front of us structured information that, for example, shows scoring against criteria, that can stop us being biased against, I don't know, let's say I'm the one who's desperate to have my own bathroom. And so it stops me being biased against that trade-off between bathroom and how near we are to the seaside. Treating people as individuals is really important, and allowing people to bring their individual perspective to a decision-making setting can also be important. And then actively challenging and testing decisions made by you and others. I'm sometimes in a decision-making setting where I'm nervous that we've fallen into groupthink, and I have on occasion simply said something I don't agree with just to test the room and check that people argue back at me. Accept your biases. Remember, this isn't about saying we are evil, we are biased. It's about recognising our biases and our preferences and feeding those in and making sure that they don't influence the decision making in an unfair or inappropriate way. And creating conditions that reduce bias, thinking about breaks, thinking about people being able to hear each other, thinking about the friendliness of the environment and the comfort that someone more junior who may perceive themselves as having less expertise, probably wrongly, feel able and comfortable to speak up. So what are the implications of this for human decision making and for design? Well, we can think about how we redesign controls and displays, cues, and then processes as well. I'm always nervous about training as a solution. As an ergonomist, I believe we should be organising the world, not organising and redesigning the people. But there are some things that we can do around awareness and understanding that really help in terms of managing decision making. We can also, in certain settings, use decision aids, expert systems and cognitive support to help us with making critical decisions. And we can think about the processes that we can implement for group decision making. Okay, so thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the section